here, and our first learning objective is to name the primary and secondary endocrine glands and the hormones associated with each. So we'll think about what does it mean to be primary versus a secondary endocrine gland. So when you think about the endocrine glands, they are derived from epithelial tissue. We sort of discussed this when we looked at the effector tissues in the autonomic system. So one of the criteria, or one of the functions rather, of epithelia is to form glands. It also forms the lining of hollow organs as well and the lining of our skin. But another crucial function is to make glands. And this includes all of our glands, like the liver, pancreas, salivary glands, you name it. They're all epithelial tissue derived. Now, primary endocrine organs are going to be primarily functioning in terms of hormone secretion, whereas secondary endocrine organs are having another primary role, like the heart, for example. But then secondarily, they do release some hormone that can play a role in the endocrine system. So it's not their main job, it's kind of like their side job. If we look at the primary glands, the hypothalamus, which is a region in the brain, remember, the hypothalamus is not a gland, it's a part of the brain. And then the pituitary gland, which is a gland also found in the brain. The pineal gland, also in the brain, are some of the major endocrine players that we find in the central nervous system. Now, outside of that, in the neck, we have the thyroid gland. And then inside the thyroid gland, we have 4 parathyroid glands. So as you can see here, the parathyroids are really embedded into the posterior aspect of the thyroid itself. And there's 2 on each pole, 2 superior and 2 inferior. You can kind of see them superimposed here. Also, the thymus is outside. So the thymus is usually the anterior mediastinum, just anterior to the heart and behind the sternum. And that also plays a role in immune functioning, specifically in the maturation of T lymphocytes, right? T cells, which are immune cells. Then we have the adrenal glands. They're found above the kidneys, so they're bilateral. And they're going to play a role in both the endocrine system as well as other functions like sodium reabsorption, sex hormone synthesis, such as androgens and so forth. So the adrenals, we talked about them having a cortex and a medulla, and that kind of has 2 different functions. The cortex secretes the hormones. The medulla is what secretes the epinephrine, norepinephrine catecholamines. So kind of 2 different regions. The pancreas is also in the abdomen. Pancreas has 2 parts as well. We'll talk about the islets of Langerhans, which are the endocrine clusters in the exocrine pancreas. So just to break that down here, an exocrine gland, we have 2 different types of glands. Exocrine glands release their hormones into ducts. So the exocrine part of the pancreas releases like amylase, lipase, those types of digestive enzymes right into the duct of the GI system. The endocrine part of the pancreas, right, to be endocrine means you release your hormones into the bloodstream instead. So because of the endocrine clusters, they are going to release their hormones into the blood and not into any ducts. Then lastly, the gonads. So the gonads, ovaries, and testes are also hormone producing. Let's look at some of the secondary endocrine glands. Again, these have a major role that is not associated with the endocrine system, but they do secondarily release a hormone. So the heart is going to release atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. That's going to have some function on sodium balance and plasma balance. The kidneys, their main job, we know, is several, but one of their roles is to secrete erythropoietin, which is the precursor to stimulate new blood cell production, new erythrocyte production. The GI tract, so the GI tract mainly for digestion, absorption, but it can release several hormones, CCK or cholecystokinin, secretin, gastrin. These all play a role in terms of our fed state, fasted state, levels of hunger, levels of satiety, etc. And so they can be a part of the endocrine system as well. The liver secretes insulin-like growth factor, or somatomedins, and these can have an effect on the growth rate, the rate of absorption, and metabolism of cells. And then the skin. So the skin is number 1, a barrier, but it also can produce or activate rather vitamin D from the sun, for example, into its active form, which is D3. And then fat is another one. Fat is really an energy reserve, but then it can also secrete leptin, which again has a role in our hunger, satiety, absorption, etc. So these are some of the secondary endocrine glands that can also play a role on the endocrine axis. Let's go to the second objective. We're going to describe the links between the hypothalamus with the anterior and posterior pituitary. And then we're also going to look at number 3, describe the role of trophic hormones in regulating the release of other hormones, including the feedback loops involved in this process. So we kind of have to look at both of these objectives together because the feedback loops involving the trophic hormones are being released from the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So we'll look at what that means when you look at the structure and the hormones released from both of those areas. So the hypothalamus is this region here in the brain. It's right below the thalamus, hence the term hypothalamus. So here's the thalamus, here's hypothalamus. And then it's connected, to the pituitary by this stalk. So here's the hypothalamus. We have several nuclei here, and nuclei are just clusters of cell bodies that have axons that project to other areas. And so the hypothalamus has axons that project to the posterior pituitary specifically. So it's really connected to the hypothalamus. The pituitary also has 2 lobes, where we just mentioned anterior, posterior, and then it has the infundibulum, which is that stalk-like connection. When we think about the posterior pituitary, because the axons from the hypothalamus, so here's the hypothalamus, here are these nuclei, which again are clusters of cell bodies, and these axons project through the infundibulum down to the posterior pituitary, and it prompts the secretion of hormones from the posterior pituitary. So these are called neurohormones because they're being released from neurons instead of the epithelial cells of a typical gland. We call these neurohormones. There are 2 examples that are released this way, ADH or vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. This is made by the paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus. It's transported through the axons that pass through the infundibulum stalk, and then it's stored and released from the posterior pituitary. The functions of ADH is to help with water balance, osmolarity, and essentially sodium balance, right? Oxytocin, on the other end, is also made in the hypothalamus, but from the supraoptic nucleus, and then similarly projected down to posterior pituitary and released here into the bloodstream. And the function of oxytocin is for milk ejection or milk letdown. We'll talk about another hormone, prolactin, which is important for milk production. So oxytocin is milk ejection or letdown around birth or after birth, whereas prolactin is milk production, which is really during pregnancy. So 2 different hormones that act on the production and ejection of milk. So the main takeaway here is that the posterior pituitary behaves differently from what we'll see about the anterior pituitary. It's connected to the hypothalamus. The hormones are made in the hypothalamus, and then they are sent down to be released from the posterior pituitary. Now, shifting to the anterior pituitary, the hormones that are made and project to the anterior pituitary are called trophic hormones. So the trophic hormones here can either stimulate or inhibit, depending on what type of hormone they are. So they're all made in the hypothalamus similarly, but they're not transported on axons. Therefore, they're not neurohormones. They are instead released into the capillary beds that pass through the hypothalamus, specifically the median eminence of the hypothalamus. Those hormones are picked up here. They are transported by a portal system to the anterior pituitary, and then they are released to the anterior pituitary where they can have their effect, again, either to stimulate the anterior pituitary or inhibit the anterior pituitary. And then from there, a second line of hormones is released from the anterior pituitary into the blood, and then it's going to go into the bloodstream and have its effect on another organ elsewhere. So this is really a hierarchy of hormone release. That's why it's referred to as an axis. a hypothalamo-pituitary endocrine axis, because there are three levels of hormone production that are sort of governing the overall outcomes. So let me repeat that here again. The trophic hormones are released from the hypothalamus into the bloodstream that passes here. They're transported in this portal system to the anterior pituitary, where they can either stimulate the anterior pituitary to release another hormone or inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing that other hormone. And then from there, a third hormone enters the bloodstream and has its effect on one of the tertiary endocrine organs, so the pancreas, the thyroid, the adrenal, etc. Now, this is going to be described as a portal system. And a portal system means that capillary beds pass through two different tissues before going back to the veins and back to the heart. So blood that arrives here at the median eminence of the hypothalamus is going to undergo exchange. This is why it goes from being bright red to purple. It undergoes exchange of oxygen, of nutrients, along with picking up the hormones from the hypothalamus. And then typically, after blood passes through a capillary bed, through one site of exchange, it usually goes to a vein and then back to the heart. In a portal system, it leaves one capillary bed and goes to another capillary bed where there's a second site of exchange, and then it goes back to the veins, and then it goes back to the heart. So two capillary beds in series before going back to the veins and to the heart is described as a portal system, which is kind of needed here, right? In order to pick these hormones up and drop them off somewhere else before going back to the heart. So when we think about the hypothalamic trophic hormones, these are the hormones that are released from the neurosecretory cells or the neurons of the hypothalamus. Again, they're dropped off here in this first capillary bed. Then we have anterior pituitary trophic hormones, which is the second level of hormones that are going to be released from the anterior pituitary. And then they're going to travel to the distant endocrine glands to trigger the release of their hormones. So an example of this axis is thyroid hormone. For example, we have TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, which is the hypothalamic trophic hormone. Okay, so TRH is released from the hypothalamus. It travels to the anterior pituitary, and it tells the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. From there, TSH leaves the anterior pituitary, enters the bloodstream, goes to the thyroid, and tells the thyroid to make thyroid hormone, T3, T4. And so the three hormones in that axis are TRH, TSH, and then thyroid hormone, which comes from the actual thyroid gland. So that is what we mean by having that hypothalamic pituitary endocrine system, or that axis. So here's a really nice summary table, and I'll share this with the recordings today. This just looks at all the various hypothalamic trophic hormones up here, anterior pituitary trophic hormones down here, and ultimately the endocrine hormones that are associated with each axis. So we can think about prolactin, for example. Prolactin has both a releasing hormone, RH, and an inhibiting hormone. The releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to make prolactin. The inhibiting hormone blocks the anterior pituitary from releasing prolactin. And then the organ where prolactin acts is the breast, and its ultimate role is milk production. Thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH, stimulates TSH production from the anterior pituitary, and then TSH stimulates thyroid hormone production from the thyroid gland, and so that is the axis for the thyroid that we discussed earlier. If you look at the adrenals, so CRH, cortisol releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, then ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then the overall gland is the adrenal cortex. Remember, not the medulla, but just the cortex is under control of this axis. And then ultimately leading to cortisol production, but other hormones as well. We'll talk about what those are. So this can be sex hormones, this can be aldosterone. There are several hormones released from the adrenal cortex. but cortisol is an example. If we look at the growth hormone axis, so they are both growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone that have an effect on growth hormone production from the anterior pituitary. The endocrine, the tertiary endocrine organs that growth hormone acts on are most of our body cells, liver cells, muscle cells, kidney cells, bone cells, and this is going to stimulate the production of insulin-like growth factor, which is going to encourage the growth of the overall body. So the growth hormone axis is going to be important when we think about growth, puberty, maturation, etc. And then lastly, the GnRH axis. This is the gonadotropin axis, so basically sex hormones. This stimulates FSH and LH production from the anterior pituitary. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. This is going to encourage the maturation of follicles, especially as it pertains to the ovarian cycle in women. And then LH is luteinizing hormone, which is also produced in terms of preparing the menstrual cycle as well. Luteinizing hormone has a role in both, but it's going to be different depending on the gonads, obviously. So when you think about the tertiary endocrine glands, testes and ovaries, testes will produce androgens as well as testosterone, and then ovaries will produce estrogen and progesterone. So that is the axis for the gonadotropin release and then the gonads that are involved. Okay. Now, I would encourage you to focus on this table. You'll see questions that come on this table from this table on your exam, excuse me. So I will share it with the lecture slides today, and then know each of these axes, know the gland, know the pituitary hormone, as well as the hypothalamic trophic hormone. Okay, let's look at the role in terms of the various points of regulation for this axis. So how do we regulate, increase, or decrease activity of the axes that we just looked at? First of all, there's neural input. So neural input means that there's sensory information that is giving instructions about this axis, depending on our various states, depending on our fasted versus fed state, depending on the levels of hormones circulating in the blood, depending on other physiologic states, we can have neurons that have a regulatory function on the axis. Then there is hormonal feedback. So again, if we have lots of thyroid hormones circulating in the blood, that's going to have a negative feedback on our TRH axis, which shuts down our TSH axis, which shuts off our thyroid hormone production. So there's a negative feedback loop that can have a regulatory control of this axis as well. Lastly, the circadian rhythm. So basically our sleep-wake cycles, our rhythmic or seasonal cycles also have an input on the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is really going to tell us about our wakefulness. This is why we get a little bit more drowsy in the winter time when the sun spends less hours in the sky. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is responsive to light that's entering the retina. So if you have lots of light entering your retina, this is what stimulates your wakefulness because of a decrease in melatonin production. However, when it gets dark, again, at certain seasons, but also certain times of the day, there's less light entering the retina, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus is going to stimulate melatonin production, and that's what makes us feel drowsy, sleepy, and less alert as light goes away. So this is going to be regulated by the circadian rhythm and essentially light in certain seasons. So here's an example of what we mean by those feedback loops. And this is just looking at trophic hormone 1, 2, 3, and then how they can have negative feedback. So there are two types of feedback loops. The short feedback loop is where the anterior pituitary trophic hormone, in the example we looked at earlier with, let's say, the adrenal axis, this would be ACTH. So adrenocorticotropic hormone would stimulate, not stimulate, rather inhibit the hypothalamus from making CRH or cortisol releasing hormone. So that would be a short loop negative feedback. A long loop negative feedback would be cortisol, for example. So cortisol released from the cortex of the adrenal would have an inhibitory effect on CRH made from the hypothalamus. So the short loop from the pituitary and the long loop from the tertiary endocrine gland itself. We also want to think about the pineal gland. It's a very small gland at the base of the midbrain, or the base of the thalamus, rather, and it is associated with melatonin release. So we just talked about the suprachiasmatic nucleus and how that is affected by light. The hormone that is released from the pineal gland is melatonin. So this is going to play an important role, as you mentioned, in seasonal processes, in rhythmic cycles. It's thought to have some effect on controlling the menstrual cycle in women. This is why the menstrual cycle is really rhythmic. It happens every 28 to 32 days, and other similar types of processes that we see in mammals across the board.